Ohio seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer amendment number 51 as the designee for Mr. Roy.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 51, printed in House Report number 118-142, offered by Mr. Davidson of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 583, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio.
I thank the Speaker. This amendment expresses a sense of Congress. This doesn't even have teeth on it. It just asks nicely, please, NATO allies, would you contribute the amount that you said you would, please? It's a kind ask. It's a sense of Congress that you should do what you said you would do. So NATO countries who choose not to invest in their own defense, specifically meeting the 2014 Wales Summit defense spending benchmark, better known as the 2% GDP commitment, should be held accountable for that. That's all it's saying, is you should actually do what you said you would do. In 2006, NATO defense ministers agreed to annually commit a minimum of 2% of their nation's GDP on their own defense. According to NATO, this spending threshold serves as an indicator of a country's political will to contribute to NATO's common defense. In 2014, the NATO alliance adopted the, quote, Defense Investment Pledge. At that time, only 3 of NATO's 28 NATO member countries were meeting their 2% defense spending commitment. At that time, the NATO alliance issued this statement, quote, we agree to reverse the trend of declining defense budgets, to make the most effective use of our funds, and to further a more balanced sharing of costs and responsibilities. Our overall security and defense depend both on how much we spend and how we spend it. They recognized the problem and they committed to change course back in 2014. The Senate ratified this pledge in 2014 with a yes vote, 97-2 in 2022. NATO's annual report showed that only 7 of now 30 NATO member countries meet the 2% GDP defense spending line. Numerous NATO member countries use the United States security umbrella to evade their financial commitments to their own defense. There's a war raging on their borders, and they're still not stepping up. If not now, when? This bill doesn't cut any. This amendment that I'm offering right now on behalf of Mr. Roy that I've co-sponsored doesn't cut anything. It just says it's a sense of Congress that you should do what you said you would do. It's a sense of what the Senate said, 97-2, when they ratified it, that, yeah, we agree with this pledge. The United States is doing it. Why in the world shouldn't our own countrymen expect the members of their alliance to do what they said they would do as part of the alliance? Failing to do this makes our alliance weaker, it makes our alliance less secure, and it sets a horrible standard for any future ally. I urge support for this amendment, and I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from the purpose, does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this week NATO leaders held a summit in Lithuania to discuss, address, and prepare for the alliance's future. It was done with the United States at the table, leading the efforts to galvanize ambitions in the face of multiple threats, most notably those related to Russia's unjust and tragic war against Ukraine. And in Lithuania, allies agreed to continue to ramp up support for Ukraine and use the 2% of GDP amount as a floor. Some of our strongest allies in the alliance are set to move even beyond that threshold in the coming years. We have not seen NATO stronger, NATO working closer together, NATO speaking together. Now, I know that the former president thought that NATO had outlived its usefulness. and that we should not be a part of it. And this amendment would lend itself to that type of mentality. When we know that the strength of NATO is its unity, when we know that what Mr. Putin was after was to divide NATO, we don't need to utilize any language or have any that would accelerate that thought. What we need to do is to make sure that we continue with the spirit of what took place at the NATO summit. The language of this amendment seeks to create disunity at a time when NATO's unity is being actively tested by Vladimir Putin. So no, we should not agree to denounce our allies in the NDAA, as this amendment does. We should not look to reignite some of the disunity and disruption that previous American first policies promoted.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to yield another 1 minute to the gentleman from New
The
York.
gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. No, we should not look to, as I said, reignite some of the disunity and disruption that America First or America Only promoted. We don't need to call out in an amendment our strongest of allies. This amendment calls out and criticizes and denounces Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, Denmark, France, many others. In the middle of war, I surely would not want to be fighting a war in a bunker, saying we're allies, and then someone is denouncing me. That is not the way allies stick together and fight an unjust war that is currently taking place in Ukraine, where you have Russia taking sovereign property of a sovereign country, taking land of a sovereign country. I yield back.
Mr. Chair, reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just point out that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. I know some of my colleagues want to make them that so, maybe so that we could already go to war with a country that would inherently involve Article 5, were they to be admitted today, because they're in a state of war today. But they're not. And so we aren't having NATO allies in bunkers right now, hunkered down, and having allies call them out. But the surest way to wind up there is to continue to underinvest in our defense. And that's exactly what more than 75% of our NATO allies are doing. They said they would invest in their defense, and they're not doing it. How do they have no shame? They expect us to carry the load? Are we going to fight and fund their wars? I mean, we did help a lot in World War I. We helped a lot in World War II. There were a lot of people that fought and died, not just Americans, to get there. But America is a great ally. And we're simply asking that they too become great allies. That's all this amendment does. It doesn't cut funding. It doesn't bail on them. It simply says, hey, we expect you to do what you said you would do. We're just calling it out. You're not doing it. Please do it. Reserve.
Reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I want to remind my colleagues that the word, as my colleague from New York has said, the word denounces is a strong word, especially to use in the heat of battle and the heat of an unprecedented, unjust war. I'd like to yield 1 more minute to the gentleman from New York,
The
Mr.
gentleman
Meeks.
is recognized for 1 minute.
What NATO has done when they've seen the taking of property from a sovereign country is stick together. The one thing that Mr. Putin did not think would happen, who thought that we would be divided, has not happened. And NATO has been stronger because they see the inhumanity and the criminal activity that is now taking place by Vladimir Putin. One voice standing together to stop that. While the Ukrainian people who are fighting, it is the allies in NATO who are giving the ammunition that is necessary to win. But for that, this war would have been over in 2 weeks or less. But it's that unity that has continued until Ukraine will win this fight. And we must stand together, not giving any weakness of disunity. I yield back.
Mr. Chair, reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
I thank the chairman. This amendment doesn't deal with Ukraine, it deals with NATO. It doesn't say anything bad. It denounces people that don't do what they said. I denounce people that don't keep their word. Shame on you. You said you would do something and you didn't do it. You should be held accountable for that. That's all we're saying. 75% of NATO countries, the biggest, strongest, biggest economies, they're the ones that are underinvesting. There's some heroes out there like Poland and Estonia that are spending more than their share of their GDP. But the biggest, wealthiest countries in Europe are underinvesting. And it's time to hold them accountable. I yield back and urge our colleagues to support this amendment.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, again, in closing, I want to reiterate the points of Mr. Meeks. At the moment when NATO is headed in the right direction, when we're seeing the greatest strength, unity, cohesion, and results and success, back to the charter, the founding charter of the organization, now is not the time to take steps backwards and denounce our allies, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Ohio, those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the